I want to share with you the moment that completely shattered the life I thought I knew. The moment when the carefully constructed reality I'd been living in collapsed like a house of cards. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening when I discovered that my husband of 8 years, Mason, had not only been having an affair with my younger sister, Brooke, but that she was now 4 months pregnant with his child. The revelation alone was devastating enough, but what came next was what truly broke me. Mason looked me in the eyes without a hint of shame and told me that Brooke would be moving into our home until they figured things out. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. What my husband and sister didn't realize as they sat across from me at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd celebrated holidays, planned our future, and shared thousands of meals, was that their betrayal had awakened something in me. Something that had been dormant during years of compromise and putting others' needs before my own. In that moment, I made a decision that would not only alter the course of my life, but would ultimately reveal the true nature of the people I had trusted most in this world. This is the story of how I lost my husband, my sister, and the life I thought I wanted, only to discover something far more valuable in the process. 7 months before that fateful Tuesday, life was exactly as I thought it should be. Mason and I had just celebrated our 8th wedding anniversary with a weekend trip to Napa Valley, a well-deserved break from our busy schedules. I had recently been promoted to senior account manager at the marketing firm where I'd worked for the past decade, and Mason's architectural practice was finally gaining the recognition he'd been working toward since we first met in college. From the outside looking in, we were the definition of a successful modern couple. Our home, a renovated craftsman in a desirable neighborhood in Portland, was the physical manifestation of our shared dreams. We'd spent 3 years meticulously restoring it, with Mason designing the renovations and me managing the budget and finding period-appropriate fixtures. Every squeaking floorboard and imperfect window frame told the story of our life together. Imperfect, but intentionally crafted. That particular Saturday morning in April, I was sitting at the kitchen island, reviewing designs for an upcoming campaign, while Mason prepared his signature weekend breakfast, sourdough French toast with fresh berries, and real maple syrup, a tradition he'd maintained since our second date. "Do you think we should invite your sister for dinner next weekend?" Mason asked casually, flipping a slice of bread in the cast-iron skillet. "It's been a while since we've seen her." I looked up from my laptop, slightly surprised by the suggestion. While Brooke and I had grown closer in recent years, our relationship had always been complicated. 6 years my junior, Brooke had been the unexpected miracle baby after my parents had been told they couldn't have more children. The age gap, combined with my parents' obvious favoritism toward their second daughter, had created a distance between us that took years of adult effort to begin bridging. "Sure, that would be nice," I replied, taking a sip of my coffee. She mentioned she's been going through some stuff with Kyle. Kyle was Brooke's on-again, off-again boyfriend of 3 years, a relationship that seemed to cycle through crises with predictable regularity. "What's going on with them now?" Mason asked, his back to me as he arranged the French toast on plates. "Not entirely sure. She was vague when we talked last week, just said they were taking some space. You know how they are." Mason nodded, placing a plate in front of me. "Well, maybe some time with her big sister is exactly what she needs. I can make that mushroom. Risotto she likes." I smiled appreciatively at my husband, feeling a familiar warmth at his thoughtfulness. This was the Mason I'd fallen in love with. Considerate, kind, the type of man who remembered people's favorite foods and made mental notes about their preferences. "You always know how to make people feel special," I said, cutting into my French. "Toast. That's why everyone loves you." Mason grinned, leaning across the island to kiss me. "Not everyone, just the people who matter." Looking back at that moment now, I can see all the signs I missed. The way his eyes didn't quite meet mine when he suggested inviting Brooke, the slightly forced casualness in his voice, the fact that he had never before been the one to suggest having my sister over. But at the time, all I saw was my thoughtful husband wanting to help my sister through another rough patch. I texted Brooke that afternoon, and she responded almost immediately, accepting the dinner invitation with an enthusiasm that, in retrospect, should have raised questions. Brooke had always maintained a certain cool indifference about spending time with us, typically accepting invitations with reluctant grace rather than eager anticipation. The following Saturday, Brooke arrived at our house precisely on time. Another departure from her usual behavior of being fashionably late to everything. She looked different somehow. Her normally elaborate makeup was subdued, and she'd exchanged her typical stylish outfits for a simple sundress that made her look younger, more vulnerable. "Look at you, all domestic goddess," she teased as I welcomed her in, gesturing to the apron I'd forgotten I was wearing. "How very 1950s of you." It was the kind of slightly barbed comment I'd come to expect from Brooke, her way of establishing the dynamic between us. I was the predictable one, the rule follower, while she was the free spirit who refused to be confined by convention. "Someone has to be practical," I replied with a practiced smile, falling into our familiar pattern of interaction. The apron keeps the marinara off my clothes, which means less laundry, which means more time for things I actually enjoy. Mason emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Brooke, perfect timing. I just opened a bottle of that Pinot Noir you liked last time." I noticed the way Brooke's expression softened when she saw Mason, a subtle shift I attributed to the natural charm my husband had always possessed. He had that effect on people, making them feel seen and appreciated with seemingly effortless attention. "You remembered?" she said, her voice carrying a note of something I couldn't quite identify. "That's really thoughtful." Throughout dinner, the conversation flowed more easily than it typically did with Brooke. She seemed genuinely interested in my work, asking detailed questions about the campaigns I was managing and offering surprisingly insightful suggestions about target demographics. Mason was at his most charming, telling entertaining stories about challenging clients and the politics of city planning boards. "So what's really going on with you and Kyle?" I asked eventually, after we'd moved from the dining room to the more comfortable seating of our living room, wine glasses in hand. "You said you were taking space?" Brooke's expression clouded, her fingers tightening around the stem of her wine glass. "It's over for good this time. I moved out last month." "What? Why didn't you tell me?" I set my glass down, genuinely surprised. Brooke and Kyle had broken up at least 3 times before, but she had always called me immediately, usually through tears and recriminations. She shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "It's different this time. I realized I was staying for the wrong reasons. Because it was comfortable. Because I was afraid of being alone." Her gaze flicked briefly toward Mason before returning to her glass. "But I think I deserve more than comfortable, you know?" "Of course you do," Mason said before I could respond. "Everyone deserves to be with someone who truly sees them, who recognizes their worth." Something about the earnestness in his voice made me turn toward him, but his expression revealed nothing beyond appropriate empathy for a family member going through a difficult time. "Where are you staying?" I asked Brooke, trying to focus on the practical aspects of her situation. "I found a month-to-month sublet. It's not great, but it'll do until I figure out my next steps." She paused, twirling a strand of hair between her fingers, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. "Actually, I've been thinking about making some bigger changes. Maybe going back to school, finishing my degree." "That's a great idea," I said, genuinely pleased. Brooke had dropped out of college in her junior year, convinced that her future lay in modeling and social media influence rather than formal education. "You always had a good mind for business. You just needed to find your motivation." "Yeah. Well, let's just say I've had some perspective shifts recently." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Sometimes life forces you to grow up, whether you're ready or not. The evening continued pleasantly enough, and when Brooke left around 10:30, she hugged me tightly, another anomaly in our usually more reserved interactions. "Thanks for tonight," she whispered. "It meant a lot, more than you know." As I closed the door behind her, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Pride that my sister seemed to be making positive changes in her life. Confusion about the subtle shifts in our dynamic. And underneath it all, an inexplicable uneasiness that I couldn't quite name. "She seems like she's doing better than I expected." "Considering the breakup," I said to Mason as we cleaned up the kitchen together. "More mature somehow." Mason nodded, rinsing a wine glass with unusual concentration. "People can surprise you. Sometimes it takes a catalyst to show who they really are." "I suppose so." I placed the last plate in the dishwasher and closed it. It's nice to think she might finally be finding her direction. Over the next 2 months, Brooke became a regular fixture in our lives. What began as occasional dinners evolved into weekly visits, then impromptu drop-ins for coffee or help with the application essays for the business program she was considering. Mason was unfailingly supportive, offering to review her essays, and even reaching out to a former client who taught in the business school she was targeting. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. "You're really going above and beyond," I commented one evening after Brooke had left. We were sitting on the porch swing, enjoying the warm summer twilight with glasses of iced tea. "With Brooke, I mean. It's sweet." Mason shrugged, his eyes on the darkening sky. "She's family, and she's making a real effort to improve her life. That deserves support." "I know, it's just, you two never used to be this close." He turned to, "Look at me then," his expression unreadable in the dim light. "People change, Claire. Relationships evolve. Isn't that what you've always wanted? For you and Brooke to be closer?" "Of course," I agreed, feeling slightly embarrassed by my observation. "And I'm grateful. It's just new, that's all." Mason put his arm around me, pulling me close. "Change can be good, right? Isn't that what you always tell your clients when they're nervous about rebranding?" I laughed, the tension dissolving. "Using my own professional wisdom against me. Very smooth, Mr. Reynolds." "I learned from the best, Mrs. Reynolds." He kissed my temple, and we sat in companionable silence as darkness fell completely. Looking back, I can see how perfectly Mason manipulated me during those months. He used my desire for a better relationship with my sister against me, making me feel petty for questioning their growing closeness. He positioned himself as the supportive husband, the bridge builder, when in reality, he was constructing an elaborate deception. There were signs, of course. The text messages that made him smile in a way that felt private, unreachable. The sudden interest in running errands that had never before been his responsibility. The convenient late nights at the office that coincided with evenings when Brooke mentioned having plans, but I didn't see them, or more accurately, I chose not to see them. I was so caught up in the narrative of family harmony, of my sister finally becoming the person I'd always hoped she could be, that I ignored the discordant notes in this seemingly perfect symphony. In early July, about 3 months after that, first dinner, I had to travel to Chicago for a 4-day conference. It was an important opportunity for networking and professional development, one that Mason had encouraged me to pursue. "You've earned this," he insisted as he helped me pack. "The firm doesn't send just anyone to represent them at national events." "I know, but the timing isn't great. We were supposed to look at those kitchen renovation samples this weekend." Mason waved away my concern. "The kitchen's waited this long. It can wait another week. This is important for your career." His supportiveness reinforced my belief in our partnership. We had always championed each other's professional growth, taking pride in each other's accomplishments. It was one of the foundations of our relationship, mutual respect and encouragement. The conference was invigorating, filled with innovative ideas and connections with like-minded professionals. I called Mason each night, sharing my excitement about new strategies I was learning and people I was meeting. "It sounds amazing," he said on our third night call. "I'm really proud of you, Claire." There was something in his voice, a slight distance, a carefulness in his words that gave me pause. "Is everything okay? You sound a little off." "Just tired," he replied quickly. "Had a long meeting with the Westbrook clients today. Their expectations are challenging. The ones who keep changing the design requirements? That would exhaust anyone." I sympathized, letting the moment of doubt pass. "I'll be home tomorrow evening. Maybe we can order from that Thai place you open a bottle of wine and you can vent properly." "Perfect. Have a safe flight. I love you." "Love you too." When I arrived home the following evening, the house was immaculate, unusually so for a period when Mason had been alone. Mason typically lived in controlled chaos when left to his own devices, with drawings and reference books spread across various surfaces and coffee mugs abandoned in unlikely places. "Did you hire a cleaning service?" I asked, wheeling my suitcase into the entryway. Mason laughed, kissing me in greeting. "No, I just thought I'd make things nice for your return. I know how you like coming home to a clean house after traveling." It was thoughtful and entirely plausible, yet something about it registered as strange. Mason had never before considered this particular preference of mine. "Well, it's appreciated," I said, choosing to accept the gesture at face value. "Let me shower and change, and then I want to hear all about your week." Later, over pad thai and wine, Mason told me about his client meetings and progress on current projects. The conversation was comfortable, normal, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Mason seemed simultaneously more attentive and more distant, a contradiction I couldn't quite reconcile. "How's Brooke doing?" I asked eventually, partly out of genuine interest and partly to see his reaction. "Have you heard from her?" If I expected a telling response, I was disappointed. Mason's expression remained neutral as he twirled noodles around his fork. "She stopped by yesterday to drop off some books she borrowed, mentioned she got an interview for that internship she applied for." "That's great," I said, watching him carefully. "Did she stay long?" "Not really. Maybe half an hour. She had some questions about her interview outfit." He shrugged, the picture of casual indifference. "I'm not exactly a fashion expert, but I told her the blue dress was more professional than the other option." The explanation was detailed enough to sound genuine while being completely unprovable. I felt a flash of shame for even harboring suspicions. What was I thinking? That my husband and sister were carrying on behind my back? It seemed absurd. The plot of a bad daytime drama, not my actual life. "Blue is definitely her color," I agreed, pushing away my unease. "Always has been, since we were kids." Life resumed, its normal rhythms after my return. Work kept both Mason and me busy, and Brooke seemed to be focused on her academic applications and interview preparation. If her visits became somewhat less frequent, I attributed it to her newfound direction and purpose, rather than any deliberate avoidance. In late August, Mason and I attended a charity gala hosted by one of his most prominent clients. It was a lavish affair at a downtown hotel, with Portland's architectural and business elite in attendance. I wore a navy gown I'd purchased specifically for the event, and Mason looked handsome in his tailored suit, his dark hair slightly tousled in the way that had first caught my attention 12 years earlier. "Mrs. Reynolds, you outshine everyone here," he murmured as we entered the ballroom, his hand warm against the small of my back. "You're biased," I replied, smiling up at him, "but I'll take the compliment." The evening progressed pleasantly as we mingled with clients and colleagues. Mason was in his element, charming and professional, introducing me with obvious pride and making sure I was included in every conversation. Around 10, I excused myself to visit the restroom, leaving Mason deep in discussion with the city's planning director. As I was washing my hands, I overheard a conversation from two women touching up their makeup at the adjacent sinks. Saw them at Riverside Park last weekend. Very cozy for a professional mentorship, one woman was saying, her voice lowered but still audible in the marble-tiled space. Mason always did have a type, the other replied with a knowing laugh. Though I have to say, this one looks remarkably like his wife. Just younger, obviously. I froze, my hands still under the running water. They couldn't possibly be talking about my Mason. It had to be another Mason entirely. How does someone even justify that? Sleeping with your wife's sister? It's beyond cliché. The water suddenly felt ice cold against my skin. I must have made some sound because both women looked up, their expressions shifting from gossip-fueled animation to horrified recognition. "Oh my God," the first woman breathed. I didn't. Stay to hear the rest. I dried my hands with mechanical precision and walked out, my mind struggling to process what I'd just heard. There had to be a misunderstanding. These women were confused, or malicious, or simply wrong. But as I re-entered the ballroom and spotted Mason across the space, laughing with a group of colleagues, doubt crept in like poison. The unexplained absences, the sudden cleanliness of the house when I returned from Chicago, the way he and Brooke had developed their own private jokes and references over recent months. I made my way back to him, forcing my expression into a neutrality I didn't feel. "Mason, I'm not feeling well. Would you mind if we left early?" Concern immediately crossed his features. "Of course not. What's wrong?" "Just a headache," I lied, avoiding his gaze. "Probably the champagne." Mason made our excuses to his colleagues, and within minutes we were in an Uber headed home. He was solicitous during the ride, asking if I needed anything, offering to stop for medication. Each gesture of care felt like a knife twist, forcing me to question everything I thought I knew about our relationship. At home, I went straight to the bathroom, claiming I needed a cool cloth for my head. Once alone, I leaned against the closed door, trying to steady my breathing and racing thoughts. I had two choices: confront Mason with what I'd heard and risk looking paranoid based on overheard gossip, or investigate first to determine if there was any truth to the allegations. I chose the latter. When I emerged from the bathroom, Mason had changed out of his suit and was sitting on the edge of our bed, looking concerned. "Feeling any better?" he asked, his voice gentle. "A little," I said, beginning my own carefully constructed deception. "I think I just need to sleep it off." Over the next week, I became someone I never thought I'd be, a wife secretly investigating her husband. I checked phone records, looking for patterns in calls and texts to my sister. I reviewed our joint bank statements and credit card bills, searching for unexplained expenses or gifts I hadn't received. I even installed a location tracking app on both our phones under the guise of safety precautions, allowing me to see where Mason went when he claimed to be working late. What I found confirmed my worst fears. Multiple calls and texts to Brooke, often late at night or when I was in meetings, charges at restaurants on days when Mason claimed to be working through lunch, and most damning of all, the location data showing his car parked outside Brooke's apartment building multiple times when he'd told me he was at the office or with clients. The evidence was overwhelming, yet still circumstantial. I needed irrefutable proof before confronting them, something neither could deny or explain away. The opportunity came unexpectedly when Mason left for a supposed 3-day conference in Seattle. He'd mentioned it only a week before, claiming it was a last-minute invitation to speak on a panel about sustainable urban design. "It's a great opportunity," he said, packing his overnight bag. "Connections with firms from the entire Pacific Northwest." I nodded, playing the supportive wife while knowing from the location app that Brooke had mysteriously taken time off work for the same 3 days. "I'm proud of you," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Call me when you get settled in your hotel. The moment his car pulled away from our house, I put my plan into action. I'd already taken the day off work, explaining to my boss that I needed to handle some personal matters. Now, instead of following Mason or confronting Brooke directly, I drove to my parents' house in Eugene, about 2 hours south of Portland. Me. Mother was surprised to see me on a weekday, but welcoming as always. Claire, what a lovely surprise. Is everything okay? Actually, no, I said, accepting her offered hug with uncharacteristic stiffness. I need to talk to you and Dad about something important. Over the next hour, I laid out everything I'd discovered for my increasingly horrified parents. The evidence, the patterns, the overheard conversation at the gala. By the end, my mother was in tears, and my father's face had turned a dangerous shade of red. I'll kill him, he said simply, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles were white. No, you won't, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. What I need from you is the key to the lake house. The lake house was a family property that had been in my father's family for generations. Located on a remote part of Crater Lake, it was where we'd spent summers growing up and where my parents now lived for part of the year. More importantly for my purposes, it was the site Mason and Brooke had used for secret rendezvous twice before, according to the location data I'd collected. Once when my parents were in Europe, and once when I was at a work retreat. Why? My mother asked, confusion momentarily overriding her distress. Because that's where they're going, not Seattle. Mason's car is currently headed south, not north. I showed them the location app on my phone. I don't want a confrontation at our house. I want neutral ground. And I want witnesses who can't manipulate or gaslight. My father handed over the key without further question, understanding in his eyes. What's your plan? I'll go tonight after they've arrived. I'm guessing they think they have the place to themselves until Sunday. I took a deep breath. I'd like you both to come too, but not with me. Come separately tomorrow morning. I want them to face not just me, but our entire family. What I didn't tell my parents was that I had already made a decision that went far beyond confronting my husband and sister. In the week since the gala, as evidence mounted and denial became impossible, I had set in motion a plan that would change all of our lives irrevocably. This confrontation wasn't just about exposure or even accountability. It was about reclaiming my power and establishing the terms by which the next chapter of my life would unfold. As I drove toward the lake house, that evening I felt a strange calm settle over me. The initial shock and pain had given way to something colder, more focused. Mason and Brooke had made their choices, had constructed an elaborate deception while watching me believe in their lies. Now it was my turn to determine what happened next. As May turned to June, subtle changes began appearing in the fabric of my everyday life. Like a loose thread in a sweater, barely noticeable at first, but once spotted, impossible to unsee. Mason and I had always maintained fairly consistent routines. He typically left for his architectural firm around 7:30 each morning, returning home between 6 and 7 in the evening. We'd eat dinner together most nights, sharing stories about our days while enjoying whatever recipe we'd decided to try that week. Weekends were for home improvement projects, farmers markets, and occasional gatherings with friends. But as summer approaches, these comforting patterns begin to shift. Mason started staying later at the office, not dramatically so, but consistently, enough to notice. Instead of 6:30, he'd walk through the door at 7:45 or 8, often with takeout as a peace offering. Henderson's commercial project is in the final design phase, he'd explain with an apologetic smile. The deadlines are brutal. The Henderson project became a recurring character in our conversations, the invisible client whose demands apparently justified longer hours, weekend work sessions, and increasingly frequent business dinners. One Wednesday evening, I called Mason around 7 p.m. when he still wasn't home. The phone rang several times before he answered, ambient noise suggesting he wasn't in his quiet office. "Hey, sorry, I'm at Miller's pub with the Henderson team," he said, voices and clinking glasses audible in the background. "Working dinner. Should have texted you." "No problem," I replied, slightly thrown by the fact that he'd never mentioned plans to go out. "Anyone I know there?" There was the slightest pause before he answered. "Just Jim and the structural engineers. Pretty technical stuff. I shouldn't be too late." I thought nothing of it until the following morning when I was scrolling through Instagram while waiting for my coffee to brew. A post from Brooke appeared in my feed, a photo of a gin and tonic on a distinctive copper bar top that I immediately recognized as belonging to Miller's pub. The caption read simply, "Unexpected encounters make the best evenings," the timestamp showed she'd posted it around 8 p.m. the previous night. It could be a coincidence, I told myself. Portland had a limited number of trendy cocktail spots, and Miller's was popular with the creative professional crowd. My sister and husband could have independently ended up at the same place without ever seeing each other. But something about it left me uneasy, a quiet alarm bell ringing somewhere in the back of my mind. Later that week, I arrived home early from work to find Mason's car in the driveway at 3:30 p.m., hours before he normally returned. Assuming he was sick or working from home, I entered our house quietly, not wanting to disturb him if he was on a call. The sound of laughter guided me toward the kitchen. Mason's deep chuckle complemented by a lighter, feminine one I instantly recognized as Brooke's. They hadn't heard me come in, giving me a few seconds to observe them unnoticed. They were standing at the kitchen island, Mason showing Brooke something on his tablet. Nothing overtly inappropriate about their positioning, yet something in their body language spoke of an intimacy that seemed out of place. They stood closer than necessary, Brooke's shoulder brushing against Mason's arm as she leaned in to see the screen. More telling was how comfortable they appeared, the easy physicality of people who had spent significant time in each other's personal space. "Hello?" I called out, feeling strangely like an intruder in my own home. They both looked up, startled. For just a moment, so brief I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, a look passed between them, a silent communication I couldn't decipher. "Claire." Mason recovered quickly, his surprise melting into a welcoming smile. "You're home early." "Half-day planning session," I explained, setting my bag down on the counter. "What are you two up to?" "Mason's helping me with my application essay," Brooke said, stepping casually away from my husband. "He's been giving me feedback on structure and presentation." I thought the application deadline wasn't until August. I moved to the refrigerator, suddenly needing something to do with my hands. "It is," Mason replied smoothly. But Brooke wanted to get ahead of it, proper planning and all that. "Very responsible," I said, trying to keep my tone light while examining their expressions. "Since when are you home in the middle of the afternoon, though?" Contractor meeting got canceled. Thought I'd take advantage of the unexpected free time to work from home. He closed the tablet, sliding it into its case. "Actually, I should get back to those renderings. The Hendersons need them by tomorrow." As Mason headed toward his home office, Brooke began gathering her things, slipping papers into a folder with studied concentration. "How's the apartment hunting going?" I asked, remembering she'd mentioned wanting to find a more permanent place than her sublet. "Slow," she sighed, avoiding eye contact. "Everything in my price range is either a complete dump or gets snapped up before I can even schedule a viewing. If you need help looking, I'm free this weekend. Mason has that architectural tour in Seattle, so my schedule is wide open." The folder in Brooke's hands stilled momentarily. "Architectural tour?" "Yeah, some historical buildings. He's been talking about it for weeks." "Right," she said, resuming her organizing with renewed focus. "I forgot about that. Thanks for the offer, but I actually have plans this weekend. Rain." Check? After Brooke left, I found myself replaying the interaction in my mind. Nothing explicitly wrong had occurred. my husband helping my sister with her application, both of them explaining their presence with plausible reasons. Yet something felt off-kilter, like a painting hanging slightly crooked on a wall. I tried dismissing my unease as unfounded suspicion, perhaps even jealousy over the newfound closeness between Mason and Brooke. Wasn't this what I'd always wanted? For my sister and husband to develop a genuine relationship rather than just tolerating each other for my sake. That evening, I casually mentioned Brooke's visit while Mason and I prepared dinner together. She seemed really focused on her application, I noted, chopping vegetables while Mason marinated chicken. It's nice seeing her take her future seriously for once. She's definitely changing, Mason agreed, his back to me as he worked. Growing up, I guess. Taking responsibility. And you've been a big help with that, I continued, watching his shoulders for any tension. She seems to really value your input. Just being supportive, he said, turning to give me a quick smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Like you've always wanted me to be with your family. That night, lying in bed beside Mason's sleeping form, I found myself staring at the ceiling, my mind circling around a growing sense of unease. Nothing concrete had happened. No smoking gun had appeared. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between my husband and sister. Something neither was acknowledging. The next morning, I made a decision I never thought I'd make in my marriage. I checked Mason's phone while he was in the shower. I had never been the suspicious type. Throughout our relationship, I'd prided myself on the trust Mason and I shared. We knew each other's phone passwords for practical reasons, but we'd never felt the need to monitor each other's communications. That had always seemed like a behavior, belonging to insecure relationships, not our solid partnership. Yet there I was, heart pounding as I entered his passcode and opened his text messages. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss. Work conversations, texts with his friends about their fantasy football league, mundane exchanges with me about groceries and dinner plans. Brooke's name appeared in his recent messages, but the texts themselves seemed innocent enough. Discussions about her application, article links related to business schools, schedule coordination for their mentoring sessions. I was about to put the phone down, feeling guilty for my suspicion, when I noticed something odd. There were no texts between them prior to April, when we'd had that dinner at our house. Despite having been in each other's lives for 8 years, their text history apparently began only 2 months ago. Before I could investigate further, the shower turned off. I quickly replaced the phone exactly where it had been and busied myself with getting dressed. That weekend, Mason left for his architectural tour in Seattle. I threw myself into work projects I'd brought home, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that I'd missed something important in my brief inspection of his phone. Sunday afternoon, Brooke called unexpectedly. "Are you busy right now?" she asked, her voice carrying an unusual edge. "I could really use some sister time. I'm just catching up on work. Is everything okay?" "Not really," she sighed. "Got some disappointing news about an apartment I was hoping for. Could use a distraction. Thought maybe we could grab coffee or something?" We agreed to meet at a cafe halfway between our places. When I arrived, Brooke was already there, fidgeting with a napkin, her expression troubled. Her eyes were slightly puffy, as if she'd been crying. "Hey," I said, sliding into the seat across from her. "That bad about the apartment?" She attempted a smile that came out more like a grimace. The apartment, life choices, the general state of the world. You know, the usual existential Sunday crisis. Throughout our conversation, Brooke seemed distracted, alternating between unusual chattiness and prolonged silences. She asked detailed questions about my work, my friends, my plans for the coming weeks, showing more interest in my life than she had in years. "How's Mason's trip going?" she asked eventually, stirring her third coffee with studied concentration. "Fine, I think. He texted this morning saying they were touring some famous library today." Something flickered across Brooke's face. Too quick. To identify but noticeable nonetheless. Seattle has great architecture, she commented, her tone carefully neutral. Though I've heard the conference scene there can be pretty wild. Architects letting loose and all that. I raised an eyebrow. Mason, at wild parties? We must be thinking of different men. His idea of cutting loose is ordering the experimental roast at a coffee shop. Brooke laughed, but it sounded forced. People surprise you sometimes, show different sides of themselves in different contexts. On my drive home, I replayed our interaction, trying to understand the strange undercurrent I'd sensed. Brooke seemed almost like she was fishing for information about Mason, while simultaneously dropping hints about something she thought I should know. Or was I reading too much into it, projecting my own growing unease onto an innocent conversation? When Mason returned that evening, I watched him closely as he unpacked, listening to his stories about the tour, the historic buildings, the networking connections he'd made. Everything sounded plausible, reasonable, exactly what you'd expect from such a trip. Yet as the week progressed, several small details began to accumulate, like pebbles forming a pattern. Mason mentioned meeting an influential architect at the Seattle conference, someone who, according to a quick internet search I conducted later, hadn't actually attended the event according to the published speaker list. A receipt fell from Mason's jacket pocket while I was doing laundry, from a restaurant in Portland, dated Saturday night when he was supposedly in Seattle. Brooke suddenly stopped coming to our house, making excuses when invited and suggesting we meet at cafes or restaurants instead. Mason began taking more private phone calls, stepping outside or into another room when his phone rang with certain contacts. His work hours grew increasingly unpredictable, with last-minute meetings and project emergencies requiring his immediate attention, often in the evenings. None of these things, viewed individually, was particularly damning. People make mistakes about who they met at conferences. Receipts can be from previous visits to restaurants. Siblings go through phases of closeness and distance. Work gets busy, requiring more attention and privacy for calls. But together, they formed a mosaic I couldn't ignore, though I desperately wanted to. In late June, about 3 months after that initial dinner with Brooke, I had a lunch meeting with Diane, a colleague who had become a close friend. As we were finishing our salads, she gave me an odd look. "I've been debating whether to mention this," she began hesitantly. "It's probably nothing, and I don't want to create problems where none exist." My stomach tightened. "What is it?" "I saw Mason last Friday evening at Riverview Park. He was with a woman. I couldn't see her face clearly, just that she had long brown hair. They seemed—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Very comfortable with each other." "My sister has long brown hair," I said, grasping at the most innocent explanation. "They've been working on her business school application together. Probably just took their mentoring session to the park since it was nice out." Diane nodded, clearly relieved by this explanation. "That makes sense. Like I said, probably nothing. They were just sitting very close on the bench, and I thought I saw him tucking her hair behind her ear, which seemed... But from a distance, it's hard to be sure what you're seeing." I smiled reassuringly, thanking her for her concern while my insides turned to ice. The gesture she'd described, tucking hair behind an ear, was intimately familiar. It was something Mason often did with me, a tender habit that had always felt special, personal. That night, I lay awake beside my sleeping husband, mentally cataloging all the small discrepancies, changed behaviors, and unusual patterns that had emerged over the past months. Each one could be explained away individually, rationalized as innocent or coincidental, but collectively, they were becoming harder to dismiss. Diane's observation had transformed my vague unease into something more concrete. The possibility I'd been avoiding thinking about directly, that Mason and Brooke might be having an affair, suddenly seemed not just plausible, but probable. I considered confronting Mason immediately, demanding explanations for all the inconsistencies I'd noticed. But something held me back. Perhaps it was fear of what I might learn, or maybe it was a more strategic instinct, a sense that I needed more information before showing my hand. The next morning, I did something I'd been resisting. For weeks, I installed a tracking app on Mason's phone while he was in the shower. The app would allow me to see his location throughout the day, providing either reassurance that my suspicions were unfounded or confirmation of my worst fears. I told myself this was a temporary measure, a way to prove my concerns were misplaced, so we could move forward without this cloud of doubt hanging over our marriage. If I found nothing unusual after a week or two, I'd delete the app and never mention it, focusing instead on rebuilding the trust that had begun to erode. It took less than 48 hours for the app to shatter that hope. On Wednesday afternoon, Mason texted that he'd be working late on the Henderson project again. The tracking app showed his location not at his downtown office, but at an address in the Pearl District, Brooke's apartment building. He stayed there for 2 hours before his location marker moved to a nearby restaurant, where it remained until nearly 10 p.m. when he finally started heading home. I quickly closed the app before he arrived, unsure how to process what I'd just discovered. When he walked through the door at 10:30, carrying the scent of a high-end steakhouse and wearing the slightly weary expression of someone who's spent hours in work meetings, I searched his face for signs of deception. "How was the Henderson meeting?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady despite the turmoil inside. "Productive, but exhausting," he sighed, loosening his tie. "We finally nailed down the atrium design that's been causing so many issues. How was your evening?" "Fine," I replied, watching as he moved around our kitchen with practiced ease, pouring himself a glass of water, completely unaware that I now knew he'd lied about his whereabouts. "Just caught up on some reading." Mason came over and kissed my forehead, a gesture that had once brought comfort, but now felt like another betrayal. "I'm going to grab a quick shower before bed." As water began running in our bathroom, I sat motionless in the living room, confronting the reality I could no longer deny. My husband was lying to me, and those lies involved my sister. The next day, I took a personal day from work without telling Mason. Instead of going to the office, I parked my car on a side street with a clear view of Brooke's apartment building entrance, feeling simultaneously ridiculous and justified. Was this what our relationship had come to? Me conducting surveillance, operations on my own husband and sister? I waited for 3 hours, alternating between intense focus on the building's entrance and waves of shame at my behavior. Just as I was about to give up, convincing myself I had misinterpreted everything, a familiar figure emerged from the building's glass doors. Mason, looking relaxed in casual clothes I hadn't seen him leave home in that morning, paused outside the entrance, checking his phone. Moments later, Brooke appeared beside him, wearing leggings and an oversized sweater that looked suspiciously like one Mason had reported lost at the gym months ago. They didn't touch or display any obvious romantic behavior. They were too careful for that in public, but their body language told a story that words couldn't hide. The slight lean toward each other as they talked, the lingering eye contact, the easy physical proximity that comes from intimacy rather than mere familiarity. I watched as they walked to a nearby cafe, sat at an outdoor table, and spent the next hour in animated conversation, occasionally laughing or leaning in to make a point. To any passerby, they might have looked like friends, colleagues, or even relatives having a casual coffee. Nothing overtly inappropriate about their interaction, but I knew better. I knew my husband's expressions, his gestures, the particular way he smiled when genuinely engaged, and I knew that what I was witnessing wasn't a mentoring session or family bonding. It was a relationship developing right before my eyes, constructed in the shadow of my marriage. As they finally parted ways, Mason heading toward his office building, Brooke returning to her apartment, I sat frozen in my car, confronting the undeniable evidence of their deception. The pieces had fallen into place, forming a picture I could no longer pretend not to see. My husband and my sister were having an affair. The question now wasn't whether it was happening, but what I was going to do about it. The knowledge of Mason and Brooke's affair sat like a stone in my stomach for the next week. I went through the motions of normal life, attending meetings, preparing meals, making small talk with my husband, while carrying the weight of what I'd seen. I hadn't confronted either of them yet, partly because I was still processing my own feelings, but also because some cautious instinct told me to gather more information before revealing what I knew. Living with deception was exhausting. Every conversation felt like navigating a minefield. Every casual question from Mason about my day seemed loaded with potential traps. I found myself analyzing his every expression, searching for signs of guilt or further lies. Sometimes I caught him watching me with an unreadable expression, and I wondered if he sensed the shift in me, if he knew that I knew. One evening in early July, Mason mentioned that his firm had been invited to submit a proposal for a major downtown revitalization project. It's going to mean some intense work over the next few weeks, he explained over dinner. Probably a lot of late nights and weekend hours. Congratulations, I said, studying his face for calls. That sounds like exactly the kind of project you've been hoping for. It is, he agreed, looking genuinely excited. If we land it, it could transform the firm's reputation, put us on the map for similar projects across the Northwest. I nodded, noting how easily he shifted from using his affair as an excuse for his absences to using actual work. It was almost impressive, this ability to weave truth and deception together so seamlessly. I'm happy for you, I said. And part of me actually meant it. Despite everything, I couldn't entirely suppress 8 years of caring about his professional aspirations. After dinner, while Mason was taking a phone call in his office, I checked the tracking app on his phone. It showed regular movement patterns between his office, our home, and various client locations, all explainable by his legitimate work. Nothing suspicious for the past few days. No visits to Brooke's apartment building? Had they cooled things off? Had I misinterpreted what I saw? Or had they simply become more careful? The following Saturday, Mason left early for what he described as a full-day charrette session with his team on the revitalization proposal. I'd verified through his firm's website that the project was real, and the timeline he'd described matched what would be expected for preparing such a proposal. With the house to myself, I decided to use the day productively, tackling the cluttered storage room we'd been meaning to organize for months. It was mindless physical work, exactly what I needed to quiet the constant churn of thoughts about Mason and Brooke. In the back corner of the storage room, behind stacked moving boxes we'd never fully unpacked, I found Mason's old laptop. He'd replaced it about a year ago, complaining that it had become too slow for the architectural rendering programs he used, but had kept it as a backup. I plugged it in, curious if it still worked. To my surprise, it powered up immediately. The login screen appeared, requesting a password I knew by heart, the same one Mason had used for years, a combination of his childhood street address and his mother's birth year. I hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard. This felt different from checking the location app or watching them from a distance. This was actively searching for evidence, crossing a line I'd never imagined crossing in our marriage. But then I remembered the look on Mason's face as he'd sat with Brooke at that cafe, the ease and intimacy between them, and I entered the password. The laptop opened to reveal dozens of saved files and folders, old projects, photos, documents from years past. I wasn't sure what I was looking for or if I'd find anything at all. Maybe this was a pointless invasion of privacy that would only make me feel worse. I clicked through folders aimlessly for a while, finding nothing particularly interesting until I opened the photos library. There, I found thousands of images sorted by date, most of them familiar. vacation photos, family gatherings, work events. I scrolled back through the years of our life together, a digital timeline of our relationship preserved in pixels. Then I noticed a folder titled simply B, tucked between project folders from the previous year. My hand trembled slightly as I clicked on it. Inside were dozens of photos of Brooke, professional quality portraits where she posed in various outfits and settings. Some looked like they could be for her attempted modeling career, while others were more casual. All of them had been taken by someone with a good eye for composition and lighting. By Mason. The timestamps showed the photos had been taken over a period of several months, beginning almost a year before the affair I'd witnessed had started. Long before that dinner at our house in April. This wasn't a recent development. This had been building for much longer than I realized. I continued exploring the laptop, now with more purpose. In the Documents folder, I found a subfolder labeled Personal that contained various text files. One was titled Thoughts.docs. Opening it revealed what appeared to be journal entries Mason had written, dated sporadically over the past 18 months. I began reading, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. November 15th. Saw B again at C's birthday dinner. Something different about her this time. The way she listened when I talked about the Westlake project, genuine interest, asking insightful questions. Not just polite attention. When did she become so engaging? Have I just never noticed before? December 4th. Dream about B last night. Disturbing. Need to focus on work, on marriage. This is just a phase, meaningless attraction that will pass. February 28th. B called today asking for advice on her apartment lease. Spent an hour on the phone. Too long. Too easy to talk to her. Dangerous territory. March 17th. C doesn't suspect anything. Why would she? Nothing has happened. Nothing will happen. Just thoughts. Just feelings I need to get under control. The entries continued, chronicling Mason's growing attraction to my sister, his guilt, his attempts to maintain boundaries, and eventually, his surrender to his feelings. The final entry was from April, just before that dinner at our house. April 2nd. Going to suggest inviting B for dinner next weekend. C will think it's just being supportive of family. Need to see B again, properly. See if what I'm feeling is real, or just fantasy. This can't continue in the shadows. Either I end it completely or... The entry stopped there, leaving the alternative unwritten but clear. He had made his choice at that dinner, setting in motion everything that followed. I sat staring at the screen, a strange calm settling over me despite the devastating contents I'd just read. There was a certain relief in confirmation, in having concrete evidence that I wasn't paranoid or imagining things. I hadn't misinterpreted innocent situations or jumped to unfair conclusions. The betrayal was real, documented in Mason's own words, but the journal entries revealed something else, something that made this discovery even more painful. This wasn't just physical attraction or a momentary lapse in judgment. Mason had developed genuine feelings for Brooke over time, feelings he had initially fought against before eventually embracing them. This wasn't just an affair. It was an emotional transfer of his affection from me to my sister. I closed the document and continued searching, no longer hesitant about invading his privacy. In his email account, which was still logged in, I found sporadic messages between them dating. Back several months, all carefully worded to appear innocent if discovered, but containing subtle undercurrents that took on new meaning now that I knew the truth. Then I found something else. A saved draft email addressed to me but never sent, dated just 2 weeks ago. Claire, I've started this email a dozen times, and deleted it each time. There's no good way to say this, no way that doesn't cause pain. But the truth is, I've developed feelings for someone else. I never meant for it to happen. I fought against it for months. But I can't deny it anymore. What makes this impossible is who it is. I know how much this will hurt you, which is why I haven't found the courage to say it. But you deserve honesty, even though it will destroy what we've built. I'm in love with Brooke. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect understanding. All I can say is that this wasn't planned or malicious. It just happened, slowly, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. I'm sorry. More sorry than I can possibly express. Mason, I read the unsent email 3 times, each reading burning the words deeper into my mind. He hadn't found the courage to send it, to tell me directly, but he'd written it. He'd acknowledged, at least to himself, that he was in love with my sister. Looking back to the photos, I examined them more carefully. They weren't overly romantic, but the perspective revealed an intimacy in how Mason saw Brooke. The careful composition, the way he captured light falling across her face, the moments he chose to preserve. These were not the photographs of a brother-in-law, but of a man seeing a woman through eyes of admiration and desire. My phone buzzed, with a text from Mason, making good progress on the proposal. Team's ordering lunch in. Probably won't be home until dinner. I stared at the message, its mundane normalcy a stark contrast to what I'd just discovered. Did he text Brooke immediately after sending this to me? Were they together right now using the proposal as cover? I checked the tracking app. His location showed him at his firm's office downtown, where he'd been since early morning. If he was lying about his whereabouts, he'd found a way to circumvent the tracking. Another text arrived, this one from Brooke. Hey sis, any chance you're free for a quick coffee today? Need to talk about something important. My blood ran cold. What could be so important that she needed to talk to me today? Was she planning to confess? Had she and Mason decided it was time to bring their relationship into the open? I responded with forced casualness. Sorry, deep in house projects today. Rain check? Maybe Monday after work? Her reply came quickly. No problem. Monday works. Hope the projects go well. I turned back to the laptop, needing more answers before I faced either of them. In Mason's browser history, I found searches for how to tell your wife you're leaving, falling in love with wife's sister, and most recently, health insurance, options for self-employed. He was planning his exit. In his saved documents, I discovered a folder containing apartment listings in a neighborhood across town, all saved within the past month. One had a note attached. B likes this one. Good. Light for painting. I hadn't even known Brooke painted. As I continued exploring the laptop, I found one final piece of evidence that broke through the strange emotional numbness that had protected me until now. In a folder labeled Future, there was a single document, a rough draft of what appeared to be a 5-year plan. It outlined professional goals, financial targets, and personal milestones, including buy house with B, scheduled for year 2, and, most devastatingly, start family in year 3. Mason wasn't just having an affair with my sister. He was planning a future with her, a future that had no place for me in it. I closed the laptop, unplugged it, and returned it exactly where I'd found it. Then I sat on the floor of the storage room, surrounded by boxes of our shared past, and finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I'd discovered. The tears, when they came, weren't the dramatic sobs I might have expected. They were quiet, steady, accompanied by a deep ache that settled in my chest like a physical presence. This wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the unraveling of my entire understanding of the 2 people I had trusted most in the world. Eventually, I pulled myself together enough to continue my storage room project, working mechanically through the remaining boxes. I needed physical activity, needed to do something productive with the restless energy coursing through me. As I sorted through old mementos, I found our wedding album, preserved in its cream leather binding. I opened it, looking at photos of Mason and me exchanging vows, cutting cake, dancing our first dance as husband and wife. We had looked so genuinely happy, so confident in our future together. Had it all been real then? Had he truly loved me before his feelings shifted to Brooke? Or had there always been something missing that I'd failed to see? In the album's pocket, I found the handwritten vows we'd exchanged, promises of honesty, faithfulness, respect, and lifelong partnership. Mason's elegant handwriting declaring his commitment to face life's challenges by my side, to choose me every day, to build a life of truth and trust together. Words that now read like fiction. I returned the album to its box, no longer feeling the sting of tears. Something harder was forming inside me, a resolve that pushed through the pain, a determination to protect myself, since no one else would. By the time Mason returned home that evening, I had showered, changed, and prepared. A normal dinner. The storage room was partially organized, the evidence of my discovery hidden away. I had decided not to confront him yet, not until I had formulated a plan for how to proceed. "How was your day?" he asked, setting his bag down and kissing my cheek casually. "Productive," I replied, serving the pasta I'd made. Got through about half the storage room, found some old photos and mementos. Something flickered in his eyes. Concern, perhaps, but it quickly disappeared. "Find anything interesting?" "Just the usual nostalgic stuff," I said, meeting his gaze steadily. Amazing how things accumulate over the years, isn't it? All the history is just sitting there in boxes waiting to be rediscovered. He nodded, relaxing visibly at my seemingly innocent response. "That's why I prefer digital storage, less physical clutter." "But digital things can be so easily deleted," I countered, keeping my tone light. "Physical evidence is more permanent, don't you think?" Mason's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "I suppose that depends on whether you want permanence." The double. Meaning in our exchange hung in the air between us, neither acknowledging it directly. We were playing a game now, each aware that something had changed but unwilling to be the first to name it. "How's the proposal coming along?" I asked, changing the subject smoothly. He launched into details about the project, seemingly relieved by the shift to safer territory. I listened attentively, nodding at appropriate moments, asking relevant questions, the perfect supportive wife. All the while, my mind was elsewhere, carefully considering my options, weighing potential courses of action. Mason and Brooke had made their choices, executed their deception with careful planning. Now it was my turn to be strategic. That night, as Mason slept beside me, the man who had vowed to love and honor me now dreaming perhaps of my own sister, I made my decision. I would not confront them immediately. I would not create a dramatic scene or demand explanations for their betrayal. Instead, I would gather more information, consult a lawyer, and prepare myself for whatever came next. If Mason was planning his exit, I would ensure I wasn't left vulnerable when he made his move. What I didn't realize then was that the situation was about to escalate beyond anything I could have anticipated. The evidence I'd discovered was devastating. Enough, but it was only the prelude to a revelation that would change everything. Monday morning arrived with the cruel brightness of a summer day that didn't care about personal tragedies. I'd slept poorly, my mind working overtime to process everything I'd discovered. Mason had already left for work by the time I dragged myself out of bed, leaving a note about another late night with the revitalization project team. I called in, sick to work for the first time in over 2 years. My supervisor, Emma, expressed concern. I'd never been one to miss deadlines or responsibilities. "Are you okay, Claire? You sound off." "Just a stomach bug," I lied, surprised at how easily the deception came. "Should be fine by tomorrow." "Take care of yourself," she said. "The Jefferson campaign can wait a day." After hanging up, I sat at our kitchen island, nursing a cup of coffee and staring at my phone. Brooke and I were supposed to meet after work. Today. The important conversation she had requested. What could she possibly want to discuss? Was she planning to confess? To justify their betrayal somehow? Or was it something else entirely? I needed more information before facing her. Making a decision. I opened my laptop and searched for divorce attorneys in Portland. The reality of what I was doing hit me as I scrolled through websites featuring compassionate faces, promising to protect my interests during this difficult time. After 8 years of marriage, I was researching how to end it. I selected 3 attorneys who specialized in high-conflict divorces and sent emails requesting consultations, describing my situation in clinical terms that belied the emotional devastation beneath. Then I did something equally practical and far more difficult. I checked our financial accounts. Mason and I maintained a joint checking account for household expenses, but we also had separate accounts for personal spending and investments. We had always operated with financial transparency, sharing passwords and keeping each other informed about major purchases or investment decisions. Our joint account looked normal. Regular deposits from our respective paychecks, automatic payments, for utilities and the mortgage, recent charges at grocery stores and restaurants. Nothing unusual there. I then checked my personal accounts to assess my independent financial position. My salary as a senior account manager provided a comfortable income, and I'd been diligent about retirement contributions and emergency savings. I wasn't wealthy, but I could support myself if necessary. When I accessed Mason's personal account, using the password he had shared with me years ago, I discovered he had been moving money. Small amounts at first, beginning about 3 months ago, then increasingly larger sums transferred to an account I didn't recognize. The most recent transfer had been for $5,000 just last week. He was building a financial cushion for his planned exit. I took screenshots of all the transactions, documenting dates and amounts, and saved them to a secure folder. This might be important information for the divorce attorneys. Then I checked our investment accounts and was relieved to find them untouched. At least he hadn't begun liquidating our long-term assets. Next, I called our insurance provider, pretending to review our coverage for the annual renewal. The customer service representative cheerfully confirmed our health insurance policy was active and unchanged. Mason hadn't removed me or added anyone else. At least not yet. By mid-morning, I had compiled a comprehensive overview of our financial situation, documented suspicious transactions, and initiated contact with legal counsel. The practical tasks had kept me focused, preventing emotional collapse, but they couldn't distract me forever. I needed to talk to someone who wasn't Mason or Brooke, someone who would understand without judgment. I scrolled through my contacts, considering and rejecting various friends whose well-meaning advice might only complicate matters. Then I thought of Vanessa. Vanessa had been my closest friend since college, before I'd even met Mason. She had moved to Seattle 3 years ago for a job opportunity, and while we didn't see each other as often as we once had, our bond remained strong. More importantly, she had experienced something similar, discovering her fiancé's infidelity weeks before their wedding. If anyone would understand without platitudes or oversimplification, it would be her. I dialed her number, praying she wasn't in meetings. "Claire," she answered, her voice warm with surprise. "This is unexpected. Everything okay?" The simple question broke something in me. "No," I managed, my voice cracking. "Everything is very much not okay." "What happened?" Concern replaced surprise. "Are you safe?" "I'm safe," I assured her, touched by her immediate focus on my physical well-being. "But my marriage is over." Over the next 30 minutes, I told her everything. The initial dinner with Brooke, the growing suspicions, the discovery of Mason's laptop with its damning evidence. Vanessa listened without interruption, allowing me to purge the story in my own words and time. When I finished, the silence stretched between us for several seconds. "I'm coming to Portland," she finally said, her tone leaving no room for argument. I can get a flight this afternoon. You don't have to do that, I protested weakly, even as relief washed through me at the thought of having her support in person. You have work and… Claire, she cut me off gently. When Mark cheated on me, you drove 6 hours to spend the weekend helping me pack his things and drinking wine while I cried. I'm coming. End of discussion. Tears filled my eyes at the memory. Thank you, I whispered. Don't thank me yet. I'm going to help you navigate this, but you might not like everything I have to say. What do you mean? I mean, you need to be strategic here. From what you've told me, Mason and Brooke have been planning this for months. They've had time to prepare, to cover their tracks, to position themselves. You can't just confront them with what you know without having your own plan in place. Her words echoed my own instincts. That's why I contacted divorce attorneys this morning. Good, she approved. What about the meeting with Brooke today? I sighed, conflicted. I'm not sure I can face her without falling apart or saying things I'll regret. Then don't, Vanessa advised. Text her that something came up at work, a client emergency you can't reschedule. Buy yourself some time. You need to understand exactly what's happening before showing your hand. The wisdom of this approach was undeniable. Okay, I'll postpone it with Brooke and pick you up at the airport. What time does your flight get in? I'll text you the details once I book it. And Claire, don't tell anyone else what you've discovered yet. Not your parents, not mutual friends. Information control is crucial right now. After ending the call, I followed Vanessa's advice and texted Brooke, fabricating a work emergency that required me to cancel our meeting. Her response came quickly, sympathetic and understanding, suggesting we reschedule for later in the week. The casual normalcy of her text felt surreal given what I now knew. With the immediate task of postponing the meeting accomplished, I turned to a more challenging issue: maintaining normality with Mason until I had developed a comprehensive plan. Could I really continue living with him, sleeping beside him, engaging in daily routines while knowing what I knew? The thought made me physically ill, but the alternative, confronting him prematurely before I had legal protection and emotional support in place, seemed equally untenable. I spent the next hour cleaning the house with almost manic energy, channeling my anxiety and hurt into physical activity. Each room I entered held memories of our life together, making the task both therapeutic and torturous. In our bedroom, I changed the sheets, trying not to think about how Mason and I had made love just 2 nights ago, his body with mine while his heart was elsewhere. Around noon, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. It was Melissa Garcia, one of the divorce attorneys I had contacted, calling personally rather than having her assistant schedule a consultation. Ms. Reynolds? I received your email regarding a potential divorce case. Based on what you've described, I think we should meet as soon as possible. Does tomorrow morning work for you? Her directness was refreshing. Yes, that would be perfect. Good. And Ms. Reynolds? Until we meet, please don't confront your husband or discuss your concerns with him. It's important that we develop a strategy before any confrontation occurs. I understand, I assured her. I've already decided to wait. Excellent. One more thing. You mentioned financial transfers to an unknown account. If possible, continue monitoring those activities, but don't intervene or question them yet. Documentation will be crucial for establishing a pattern of behavior. After setting the appointment details, I felt slightly calmer. Having professional guidance made the situation seem more manageable, less like my life was spiraling completely out of control. My phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa. Flight lands at 4:35 p.m., Terminal C, staying until Sunday unless you need me longer. I texted back, I'll be there. Thank you for doing this. Her response was immediate. That's what ride or die means, babe. Now start making a list of every question you want answered during your attorney meeting tomorrow. Be specific. Following her advice, I created a detailed list of questions covering financial implications, property division, legal processes, and potential scenarios. The exercise kept me focused on practical matters rather than drowning in emotional turmoil. At 3 p.m., I left to pick up Vanessa. At the airport, as I backed out of the driveway, a notification appeared on my phone. The tracking app alerting me that Mason had left his office and was headed toward Brooke's apartment. So much for the intensive revitalization project work. The familiar anger and hurt surged again, but I pushed it down, concentrating on navigating traffic. I couldn't afford to fall apart while driving. The emotions would have to wait. Portland International Airport was busy with summer travelers. I parked in short-term parking and headed to Terminal C, arriving just as passengers from the Seattle flight began emerging from the security area. Vanessa spotted me first, her tall figure moving purposefully through the crowd. When she reached me, she dropped her weekender bag and wrapped me in a fierce hug. "I've got you," she murmured against my hair. "We'll figure this out." For the first time since discovering Mason's laptop, I allowed myself to fully feel the pain, sobbing quietly against my friend's shoulder while travelers flowed around us, a small island of grief in a sea of airport normalcy. Eventually, I pulled myself together, wiping my eyes with the tissues Vanessa produced from her purse. "Sorry for the meltdown." "Never apologize for appropriate emotional responses to betrayal," she said firmly. "Now let's get out of here and develop a battle plan." Rather than returning home, where Mason might arrive earlier than expected, we went to a quiet restaurant, in a neighborhood unlikely to be frequented by either Mason or Brooke. Over appetizers and wine, Vanessa helped me organize my thoughts and information. "First," she said, taking a clinical approach that helped me remain objective, "we need to understand exactly what their plan is. Based on what you've found, Mason, appears to be preparing to leave you for Brooke. The financial transfers, apartment research, and unsent email all point to that." I nodded, picking at my salad without appetite. "But why haven't they done it yet? What are they waiting for?" "Good question. Maybe a specific timing related to work or finances. Maybe they're still working up the courage to hurt you. Or maybe there's something else going on we don't know about yet." "Like what?" Vanessa hesitated, taking a sip of her wine before answering. "Like pregnancy, financial trouble, or some other complication. People don't usually drag out affairs this long without some catalyst pushing them toward resolution." The thought of Brooke pregnant with Mason's child sent a cold wave through me. It seemed too horrific to contemplate, yet wasn't outside the realm of possibility. If that were the case, if she were pregnant, wouldn't they have already told me? Why continue the deception? "People convince themselves they're waiting for the right time to deliver devastating news," Vanessa replied. "But really, they're just postponing the inevitable because they're cowards." Her bluntness was exactly what I needed. No sugarcoating, no platitudes about how things would get better with time. Just an honest assessment of the situation. "What's my next step after meeting with the attorney tomorrow?" I asked, pushing away the half-eaten salad. "That depends on what you want the outcome to be," Vanessa said carefully. "Do you want to try to save your marriage? Or are you certain it's over?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't considered the possibility of reconciliation, assuming the discovery of their affair automatically meant the end of my marriage. But was that necessarily true? Could a relationship survive such a profound betrayal? "I don't know," I admitted. Part of me can't imagine ever trusting Mason again after this, but another part. I trailed off, struggling to articulate my conflicted feelings. "Another part still loves him," Vanessa finished for me. "That's normal, Claire. Love doesn't just disappear overnight, even after betrayal." "But it's not just the affair," I said slowly, realizing this as I spoke. "It's the calculated deception. The fact that it's my sister. The future he was planning with her while living with me. That shows a level of, I don't know, sociopathic behavior? How do you come back from that? Vanessa nodded, understanding, in her eyes. You may not be able to. And that's okay too. But you need to be clear about what you want before deciding how to proceed. We spent the next hour discussing potential approaches, confronting them together or separately, involving my parents or keeping the situation contained, pursuing divorce immediately or considering a trial separation. Each option had merits and drawbacks, and by the time we finished dinner, I felt more grounded, more in control of the uncontrollable. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, my phone buzzed with a text from Mason. Working late again. Don't wait. Until dinner. Sorry to be so absent this week. We'll make it up to you this weekend. I showed the message to Vanessa, who shook her head in disgust. The audacity of cheaters never ceases to amaze me. Let's check the tracking app. Mason's location showed him back at his office downtown. He had spent approximately 2 hours at Brooke's apartment before returning to work. I tried not to visualize what had transpired during those 2 hours, but my imagination supplied unwanted images anyway. Should I respond? I asked Vanessa. Yes, but keep it neutral. Don't give any indication that anything has changed. I typed, no problem. Good luck with the project. See you when you get home. Perfect, Vanessa approved. Now, let's go back to your place. I want to see that laptop. We drove to my house, where Vanessa helped me retrieve Mason's old laptop from the storage room and set it up on the dining room table. I showed her the journal entries, photos, and plans I'd discovered, watching her expression darken as she absorbed the extent of the betrayal. This is, she began, then stopped, apparently unable to find adequate words. I know, I said quietly. Vanessa continued exploring the laptop, finding additional evidence I had missed in my initial shock. Emails between Mason and a realtor about housing options in neighborhoods Brooke had expressed interest in. Research on relationship counseling specifically focused on complex family situations, and a folder of legal documents including templates for cohabitation agreements. He's been methodically planning this transition for months, Vanessa observed, her voice tight with controlled anger on my behalf. This isn't impulsive or accidental. This is calculated. I nodded, a strange calm settling over me as the full scale of Mason's deception became clear. He wanted everything arranged before telling me, a clean break with minimal disruption to his life. At the expense of yours, Vanessa added. Classic narcissistic planning. His comfort and convenience are prioritized above your emotional well-being. We spent another hour documenting everything on the laptop, saving copies of the most damning evidence to a secure cloud account Vanessa helped me create. Then we returned the laptop exactly as we'd found it, leaving no trace of our investigation. By the time we finished, it was after 9 p.m., and Mason still hadn't returned home. The tracking app showed him now at a restaurant near his office, presumably having dinner with colleagues as part of the project work he'd mentioned, or perhaps with Brooke, though that seemed unlikely given the public location and risk of being seen together. What now? I asked Vanessa as we sat in my living room, mentally and emotionally exhausted from the day's activities. Now we prepare for my favorite part, she said, a determined glint in her eye. Building your war room. My what? Your strategic command center, she explained, pulling a notebook from her bag. We need to compile all evidence, identify potential allies, map out timelines, and develop contingency plans for various scenarios. By the time you confront Mason and Brooke, you'll be 10 steps ahead of whatever they might throw at you. As Vanessa outlined her approach, I felt something shifting inside me. Grief and shock gradually giving way to resolve. Yes, my husband and sister had betrayed me in the most intimate way possible. Yes, the life I had built was crumbling around me. But I wasn't powerless in this situation. I had truth on my side. I had support in Vanessa, and soon, legal counsel in Melissa Garcia. I had financial independence and professional success that existed completely separate from my marriage. Most importantly, I had my own strength, a resilience I was only beginning to recognize as Vanessa, and I worked late into the night, transforming devastating betrayal into strategic advantage. When Mason finally came home at 11:30 p.m., he found Vanessa and me sharing a bottle of wine, photo albums spread across the coffee table, seemingly engaged in nostalgic reminiscence. "Vanessa," he exclaimed, genuine surprise in his voice. "I didn't know you were visiting." "Surprise trip," she explained smoothly, raising her wine glass in greeting. "Claire and I were just looking at old college photos. Remember that spring break in Cancun?" If Mason noticed anything unusual in our casual demeanor or the strategic placement of photo albums that hid our actual work, he gave no indication. He joined us briefly, making appropriate small talk before excusing himself to shower. "Oscar-worthy performance," Vanessa whispered once the bathroom door closed. "Both of you." "I learned from the best," I replied, nodding toward my husband's retreating form. "He's been putting on a show for months." That night, as I lay beside Mason in our bed, Vanessa comfortably settled in our guest room, I stared at the ceiling, listening to his steady breathing. The man I had married, had built a life with, had trusted with my heart and future, now a stranger beside me. Tomorrow would bring my meeting with the attorney, more evidence gathering, and careful planning. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with difficult conversations and painful decisions. But for the first time since discovering Mason's betrayal, I didn't feel like I was drowning. I was swimming, deliberately, strategically, toward a shore I couldn't yet see but knew existed. Whatever Mason and Brooke had planned, whatever they thought would happen when their deception finally came to light, they had severely underestimated the woman they were dealing with. Their betrayal had awakened something in me, a determination and clarity of purpose that would ultimately reshape all our lives in ways none of us could yet imagine. The next morning, I woke before Mason, carefully, slipping out of bed without disturbing him. After a quick shower, I dressed in the bathroom, selecting a charcoal gray suit that projected confidence and professionalism for my meeting with the attorney. By the time Mason emerged from the bedroom, I was in the kitchen with Vanessa, both of us sipping coffee and maintaining the fiction that this was just a casual visit between old friends. "Early meeting?" Mason asked, eyeing my formal attire with mild curiosity as he poured himself coffee. "Client presentation," I lied smoothly. "The Jefferson campaign finally moved forward, and Emma wants me to lead the pitch." Mason nodded, accepting the explanation without question. "That's great. You've been working on landing that account for months." The ease with which we both navigated these deceptions, his long-established, mine newly formed, created a surreal atmosphere in our once honest kitchen. "Good luck with the revitalization proposal today," I offered, matching his casual tone. "When is the final submission due?" "End of next week," he replied, grabbing a bagel from the bread box. "We're making good progress, but there's still the financial projections section to finalize." We continued this dance of normalcy for several minutes, discussing work commitments, household matters, weekend plans, as if our marriage wasn't built on a foundation that was actively crumbling beneath us. Vanessa participated seamlessly, asking appropriate questions about Mason's architectural projects and sharing sanitized updates about her life in Seattle. After Mason left for work, Vanessa and I exchanged looks of grim satisfaction at our successful performance. "Ready for the attorney?" she asked, helping me gather the documentation we'd organized the previous night. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, double-checking that I had everything: financial records, timeline of events, copies of the evidence from Mason's laptop, questions I wanted to ask. Attorney Melissa Garcia's office occupied the 15th floor of a downtown high-rise, its reception area projecting exactly the blend of warmth and professionalism I needed. The walls featured abstract art in calming blues and greens, while the furniture, modern but comfortable, suggested both competence and compassion. Melissa herself embodied these same qualities. In her early 50s with silver streaks dark, hair and penetrating brown eyes, she projected an aura of someone who had seen everything and could handle anything. She greeted me with a firm handshake, acknowledging Vanessa with a nod when I explained my friend was providing support. "I appreciate you seeing me so quickly," I said as we settled into her office. "Your situation warrants immediate attention," she replied, opening a notebook. "You mentioned discovering your husband's affair with your sister, along with evidence of financial transfers and plans to leave the marriage. Let's start with a comprehensive overview of everything you know." For the next 45 minutes, I walked Melissa through the entire situation, from the initial dinner with Brooke in April to the damning evidence on Mason's laptop, the financial transactions, and our current state of uneasy pretense. Vanessa occasionally added contextual details or clarified timeline points, her presence providing both emotional support and an additional perspective. Melissa listened attentively, taking notes and asking occasional questions to clarify specific points. When I finished, she sat back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "First, I want to acknowledge how difficult this must be," she said, her tone professional but kind. "Betrayal by a spouse is devastating under any circumstances. When it involves a family member as well, the complexity increases exponentially." I nodded, appreciating her recognition of the dual betrayal. "Now, from a legal perspective, you're in a relatively strong position despite the emotional challenges. Oregon is an equitable distribution state, meaning marital assets will be divided fairly, though not necessarily equally, in a divorce. The fact that you've maintained separate accounts alongside joint finances actually simplifies matters somewhat." "What about the money Mason has been transferring out?" I asked. "That's potentially problematic for him, not you," Melissa explained. "If we can prove he's been deliberately hiding or diverting marital assets in preparation for divorce, the court takes a dim view of such behavior. Those transfers would likely be factored into any final settlement." She turned to a new page in her notebook. "Now, before we discuss specific legal strategies, I need to ask, what outcome are you hoping for? Is reconciliation a possibility you want to pursue, or are you certain the marriage is over?" The question echoed what Vanessa had asked the previous day, and I gave it the same careful consideration. "At this point, I can't imagine rebuilding trust after such a calculated betrayal," I said slowly. "It's not just the affair, it's the months of deception, the detailed exit strategy, the involvement of my sister. I think the marriage is over, but I want to proceed carefully, understanding all my options before making any irreversible decisions." Melissa nodded approvingly. "That's a measured approach. In cases like yours, I generally recommend preparing thoroughly before any confrontation occurs. Once emotions enter the equation, and they inevitably will, having a clear strategy in place becomes essential." For the next hour, she outlined potential approaches: filing for divorce immediately versus waiting to gather more evidence, considerations regarding the marital home, options for temporary living arrangements during separation, and financial protections I should implement regardless of which path I chose. "What about Brooke?" Vanessa asked. "Does Claire have any legal recourse regarding her sister's role in this?" "Legally speaking, your recourse against your sister is limited," Melissa acknowledged. "Some states still recognize alienation of affection lawsuits, but Oregon isn't one of them. Your primary legal relationship is with your husband, not your sister." I nodded, having expected this answer. "I'm more concerned about protecting myself than punishing either of them." "That's a healthy perspective," Melissa said. "Focus your energy on securing your future rather than seeking retribution, though I understand the impulse for justice." As our consultation concluded, Melissa provided a detailed action plan, immediate steps to protect my finances, documentation to gather, and a preliminary timeline for potential legal proceedings. She also recommended a therapist who specialized in betrayal trauma, recognizing that legal strategy was only one aspect of navigating this situation. One final question, I said as Vanessa and I prepared to leave. Should I confront Mason with what I know, or wait until legal preparations are complete? Melissa considered this carefully. There are advantages to both approaches. Waiting allows you to prepare more thoroughly, but it also means continuing to live with deception, which takes a psychological toll. If you do decide to confront him, I strongly recommend having your financial protections in place first. Transfer your portion of joint assets to secured accounts. Document everything of value in the home, and have a safe place to stay if the confrontation goes poorly. With a handshake and a promise to be available if anything changed, Melissa concluded our meeting. As Vanessa and I rode the elevator down to the parking garage, I felt simultaneously overwhelmed and empowered. The legal complexities were daunting, but having professional guidance provided a pathway through the chaos. What did you think? I asked Vanessa as we reached my car. She's exactly what you need. Practical, thorough, and not easily manipulated by emotional appeals. Vanessa fastened her seatbelt. What's your next move? I checked the time, just past noon. First, I need to stop by the bank to begin implementing some of Melissa's financial recommendations. Then I want to reconnect with Brooke, see if I can understand what she was so anxious to discuss. Are you sure you're ready to face Brooke? Vanessa asked, concern evident in her voice. That's going to be emotionally challenging. I need to know what she was planning to tell me, I replied, navigating out of the parking structure. If Mason and I are approaching some kind of confrontation, I want all the information possible beforehand. At the bank, I met with a personal banker who helped me establish new accounts in my name only, ensuring they had no connection to Mason or our joint finances. I didn't transfer funds yet, that would come later, after careful consideration of Melissa's advice. But having the infrastructure in place provided a sense of security. After finishing at the bank, I texted Brooke. Sorry about yesterday. Work. Craziness has calmed down. Still want to talk? I could have coffee around 3 hour. Her response came almost immediately. Yes, please. Same place as we planned before? This is important. The urgency in her text reinforced my determination to uncover what she wanted to discuss. Was she planning to confess? To test the waters for my reaction to her relationship with Mason? Or was it something else entirely? I confirmed the meeting. Details. Then Vanessa and I grabbed lunch at a nearby cafe, strategizing my approach to the conversation with Brooke. Don't reveal what you know, Vanessa advised. Let her talk. See what she discloses voluntarily before showing any cards. What if she confesses everything? I asked, pushing salad around my plate without appetite. Even if she does, which I doubt, maintain control of your reactions. The moment you become emotional, you lose the strategic advantage. Vanessa reached across the table to squeeze my hand. I know it's asking a lot, but try to approach this like an intelligence-gathering mission, not a confrontation. At 2:45, I arrived at the coffee shop, an artisanal cafe in Northwest Portland that Brooke had suggested. Vanessa had offered to come with me, but we'd decided her presence might inhibit Brooke's openness. Instead, she dropped me off and went to a bookstore across the street, available by text if I needed support. I selected a table in a quiet corner, ordered a cappuccino, and waited, trying to calm the nervous energy coursing through me. How would I react seeing my sister now, knowing what I knew? Could I really maintain composure while looking into the face of someone who had betrayed me so profoundly? At 3:05, Brooke rushed in, looking flustered and apologetic. She wore a loose-fitting sundress and minimal makeup, her hair pulled back, in a simple ponytail, a stark contrast to her usually meticulous appearance. Sorry I'm late, she said, sliding into the chair across from me. Parking was a nightmare. I studied her face, searching for signs of guilt or deception, but saw only nervous anticipation. "No problem. What's this important thing you wanted to discuss?" Brooke fidgeted with her handbag, avoiding eye contact. "I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how to start." My heart raced, anticipating the confession that seemed imminent. "Just say it, Brooke. Whatever it is." She took a deep breath, then met my gaze directly. "I'm pregnant." Despite having considered this possibility, hearing the words spoken aloud hit me with physical force. I gripped my coffee cup tightly, focusing on maintaining a neutral expression, while my mind screamed, "I see." I managed, my voice remarkably steady. "How far along?" 16 weeks, she replied, watching my reaction carefully. I've known for a while, but wasn't ready to tell anyone until I was past the first trimester. 16 weeks. I did the mental calculation. That would place conception in early April, around the time of that first dinner at our house. The beginning of their visible affair, though based on Mason's journal entries, their emotional relationship had started much earlier. "Who's the father?" I asked, the direct question flying from my lips before I could consider a more strategic approach. Brooke's expression shifted, surprise, then something like relief. "That's part of what I need to talk about." I waited, letting silence draw out between us, forcing her to fill it. "It's complicated," she continued, her voice lowering. "I was seeing someone, but it wasn't public knowledge." Another pause as she seemed to gather courage. "It's Kyle's baby," she finally said. I blinked, momentarily disoriented by this unexpected claim. "Kyle? Your ex-boyfriend Kyle? The one you broke up with in April?" Brooke nodded, twisting a napkin between her fingers. "We had a reconciliation right before the final breakup. Then I found out I was pregnant after we'd already ended things for good." The timeline matched her story, but it contradicted everything I discovered about her relationship with Mason. Was she lying about paternity? Or had I misinterpreted the evidence, jumping to conclusions about the affair? "Does Kyle know?" I asked, trying to make sense of this new information. "Yes," she sighed. "He knows, but he doesn't want to be involved. Says he's not ready for fatherhood." Her voice hardened slightly. Not that I expected anything else from him. A suspicious part of me wondered if this was an elaborate cover story. Way to explain her pregnancy without revealing Mason's involvement. But her evident emotion seemed genuine, and the bitterness toward Kyle felt authentic. "That's why I've been making all these changes," Brooke continued, unaware of my internal confusion. "Going back to school, looking for a better apartment. I need stability for this baby. I can't keep living the way I have been." I nodded automatically, still trying to reconcile this narrative with the evidence of her affair with Mason. If Brooke was pregnant with Kyle's child, what explained the intimate relationship I'd witnessed between her and my husband? What about Mason's journal entries, his plans for a future with her? "There's something else," Brooke said, interrupting my racing thoughts. "And this is the hard part." My stomach tightened, anticipating the other shoe about to drop. "I need a place to stay for a while," she said in a rush. "The sublet ends next week, and the apartment I was hoping for fell through. Everything in my price range is either unavailable or completely unsuitable for a baby. I was wondering—" She hesitated, looking almost afraid to continue. "If I could stay with you and Mason, just until I find something permanent. A month, maybe 2 at most." The audacity of the request momentarily stunned me into silence. My sister, who had been having an affair with my husband, was asking to move into our home, ostensibly because of a pregnancy she claimed was fathered by her ex-boyfriend, but which the evidence suggested might actually be Mason's. "That's a big ask," I finally said, struggling to maintain my composure. "I know," Brooke acknowledged, reaching across the table to grasp my hand. "And I wouldn't ask if I had any other option. Mom and Dad's place is too far from my doctor and the business. School. My friends are all in studio apartments or have roommates already. You and Mason have that big house with the spare bedroom that's just sitting empty. The spare bedroom. The one Mason and I had once discussed converting into a nursery for our own future children, a conversation that had faded as his interest in starting a family waned over the past year. Now I understand why. I'd need to discuss it with Mason, I said, buying time while my mind worked furiously to understand what was happening. This impacts both of us. Of course, Brooke agreed quickly. I just wanted to talk to you first, sister to sister. But I think Mason will be supportive. He's always been so kind and understanding about my situation. The irony of her statement was almost physically painful. I forced a smile that felt like a grimace. Let me talk to him tonight and I'll let you know. Relief flooded Brooke's face. Thank you. This means everything to me, Claire. I know we haven't always been close, but you're the only person I can really count on right now. The sincerity in her voice made me question everything again. Was my sister genuinely in need, unaware of Mason's feelings for her? Or was this an elaborate performance? Part of a plan she and Mason had devised to transition their relationship from secret affair to open partnership? We spent another 30 minutes discussing her pregnancy, symptoms, doctor's appointments, plans for continuing school while preparing for motherhood. Throughout the conversation, Brooke never once indicated awareness of Mason's romantic interest or any improper relationship between them. Either she was an Oscar-worthy actress, or there was a piece of this puzzle I was still missing. After saying goodbye with a promise to call her later about the living arrangement, I walked across the street to meet Vanessa, my mind whirling with confusion. How did it go? Vanessa asked, guiding me to a quiet corner of the bookstore cafe. I don't know what to think anymore, I confessed, recounting Brooke's pregnancy announcement and her claim about Kyle's paternity. Nothing makes sense. If she's telling the truth about Kyle being the father, what explains everything we found on Mason's laptop? His feelings for her, their time together, his plans for a future with her? Vanessa considered this, her expression troubled. There are several possibilities, none of them good. Mason could be in love with Brooke without her awareness or reciprocation, a one-sided obsession. Or they could both be lying. Maybe the baby is Mason's and their C. Kyle's story is cover. Or maybe I've completely misinterpreted everything, I suggested, doubt creeping in. Maybe Mason's journal entries and plans are about someone else entirely, and I jumped to conclusions because of the timing. That seems unlikely given the evidence, Vanessa countered gently. The photos in his laptop were definitely of Brooke. His journal entries mentioned her by name. The timing aligns perfectly with their increased contact. She was right, of course. The evidence of Mason's feelings for Brooke was undeniable. What remained unclear was whether Brooke shared those feelings or even knew about them. And now she wants to move in with us, I added, the full absurdity of the situation hitting me anew. My pregnant sister wants to live in my home with my husband who's in love with her. It's like a twisted soap opera. What are you going to do? Vanessa asked. I took a deep breath, attempting to restore order to my chaotic thoughts. I need more information before making any decisions. Tonight, I'll talk to Mason about Brooke's request to move in. His reaction might tell me something useful. On the drive home, I called my mother, not to discuss Mason or Brooke's pregnancy, but to casually inquire about family history. Specifically, whether she'd heard from Kyle recently. Kyle? She responded, surprised by the question. Brooke's ex? Not that I know of. Why do you ask? Just curious, I said lightly. Brooke mentioned him the other day, and I wondered if they might be getting back together. My mother snorted dismissively. Not likely. Last I heard, he moved to Chicago for some job opportunity. Good riddance, if you ask me. That boy was never right for her. Chicago. If Kyle had indeed moved to Chicago, it complicated Brooke's story about a recent reconciliation. Something wasn't adding up. By the time I arrived home, my initial confusion had transformed into renewed suspicion. Too many inconsistencies, too many convenient explanations that didn't quite fit the evidence. Whatever was happening between Mason and Brooke, I was increasingly certain that I wasn't getting the full truth from either of them. As I entered our house, finding it empty with Mason still at work and Vanessa getting groceries for dinner, I felt a grim determination replacing the emotional turbulence of the past few days. Tonight, when I discussed Brooke's pregnancy and housing request with Mason, I would be watching his every reaction with new eyes, not just as a betrayed wife, but as an investigator closing in on a truth that grew more troubling with each new revelation. Tuesday evening arrived with a palpable tension hanging in the air of our home. Mason returned from work around 7:30, looking tired but satisfied, the expression of someone who'd had a productive day. Vanessa had tactfully made herself scarce, claiming she wanted to catch up with another friend in Portland for dinner, giving Mason and me privacy for what promised to be a pivotal conversation. I'd spent the afternoon mentally preparing, rehearsing different approaches and anticipating various reactions. The stakes felt impossibly high. Not only was I potentially confronting my husband about his betrayal, but I was also introducing the bombshell of my sister's pregnancy and housing request, a perfect storm of emotional landmines. "Something smells amazing," Mason commented as he set his bag down in the entryway. I'd prepared his favorite pasta dish, a small manipulation, I admitted to myself, designed to create a false sense of security before the difficult discussion ahead. "Thought you deserved something special after all the late nights you've been putting in?" I replied, my voice steady despite the tension coiling through me. Was I really capable of this level of deception? Has Mason's betrayal fundamentally changed me already? We ate dinner with the television news providing background noise, discussing safe topics, work projects, local politics, an upcoming art exhibition we'd planned to attend. The normalcy of it felt surreal, given what I knew, what I suspected, and what I was about to bring up. After dinner, as Mason helped clear the dishes, I took a deep breath and plunged in. I had coffee with Brooke today. His hands stilled briefly as he loaded plates into the dishwasher, then resumed their task with deliberate casualness. "Oh? How is she?" I watched his face carefully, noticing the slight tension around his eyes, the almost imperceptible straightening of his shoulders. Subtle tells I might have missed if I hadn't been looking for them. "She had some big news, actually," I continued, leaning against the counter. "She's pregnant." The glass Mason was rinsing slipped from his fingers, clattering into the sink but thankfully not breaking. He recovered quickly, reaching for a dish, towel to dry his hands. "Pregnant?" he repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "Wow, that's unexpected." 16 weeks along, I added, noting the quick calculation that crossed his features. "Did she say who the father is?" he asked, his back to me now as he wiped down the countertop with unnecessary thoroughness. "She claims it's Kyle's, says they had a reconciliation before breaking up for good." Mason turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "Claims? You don't believe her?" The question hung between us, loaded with implications. I shrugged slightly, maintaining an air of casual concern. "It seems odd timing, that's all. And Mom mentioned Kyle moved to Chicago months ago, which doesn't quite fit Brooke's timeline." "People travel," Mason offered too quickly. "Maybe he visited, or she went there. Long-distance hookups happen." His defense of the scenario struck me as telling. He was invested in maintaining the Kyle narrative. But why? If he and Brooke were having an affair and the baby was his, wouldn't this be the moment to come clean? Maybe, I conceded, watching him closely. Anyway, she also asked for a favor, a big one. Mason's expression shifted to wariness. "What kind of favor?" "Her sublet is ending, and she can't find an affordable place. She asked if she could stay with us for a while. "A month or two," she said, "until she finds something permanent." The blood drained from Mason's face so rapidly I feared he might faint. He gripped the edge of the counter, visibly struggling to compose himself. "Move in? Here? With us?" Each question emerged as if he couldn't quite process the concept. "That was my reaction too," I said, feigning ignorance of his distress. "It's a lot to ask, especially since we value our privacy. But she's pregnant, apparently alone, and she is my sister." Mason ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized as signaling deep discomfort. "What did you tell her?" "That I needed to discuss it with you first. It affects both of us." He nodded, seemingly relieved that no commitment had been made. "Let me think about it. It's just so complicated." "Is it?" I pressed gently. "It seems straightforward. My pregnant sister needs temporary housing. Unless there's something I'm missing?" Mason's eyes darted to mine, then away again. "No, of course not. Just timing, with the revitalization project and everything. The house would be less peaceful." "I understand," I said, stepping closer to him. "But family is family, right? And you've always gotten along well with Brooke." The trap was set, the bait dangled. Would he reveal himself now? "I'll sleep on it," he said finally, clearly buying time. "We can discuss it more tomorrow when I'm not so tired from work," I acquiesced, pretending his evasion was perfectly reasonable. "Fair enough. I told Brooke I'd let her know in a couple of days." Later that night, as Mason showered, I checked his phone. As expected, there were frantic texts to Brooke. "Claire knows you're pregnant, says you told her it's Kyle's. What's going on? She says you asked to move in with us." Brooke's response had come quickly. "I had to tell her something. Kyle made sense as he's not around to deny it. And yes, I asked about staying there. We discussed this. It's the perfect solution until we figure things out. Trust me." Mason had replied, "This is insane. We need to talk. Tomorrow lunch, our usual place." One die. I returned the phone exactly as I'd found it, my suspicions now fully confirmed. Whatever was happening between Mason and Brooke, they were coordinating their stories and planning something together. The Kyle paternity claim was a deliberate lie, and the request to move in was apparently part of some strategy they'd previously discussed. But why? What possible advantage could come from having Brooke move into our home? It seemed like the riskiest approach imaginable if they were trying to hide their affair. When Vanessa returned later that evening, I filled her in on everything: Mason's reaction, the texts I'd discovered, my growing confusion about their actual plan. "This makes no sense," Vanessa agreed, keeping her voice low, though Mason had already gone to bed claiming exhaustion. "Why would they want her to move in if they're having an affair? It's like trying to hide a fire by pouring gasoline on it." "Unless the pregnancy really did change their timeline," I suggested. "Maybe they're accelerating whatever endgame they had planned. Or maybe—" Vanessa paused, her expression troubled. "Maybe having her move in is part of their strategy for ending your marriage, creating an untenable living situation that forces a breaking point." The possibility sent a chill through me. It was manipulative enough to be plausible, yet so cruel I struggled to believe even Mason and Brooke could conceive of such a plan. "There's only one way to find out," I said finally. "Tomorrow, I will follow them to their lunch meeting." The Baun. Next day unfolded according to the plan Vanessa and I had developed. I told Mason I had client meetings all day, while Vanessa claimed she was meeting a friend for shopping. Instead, we positioned ourselves strategically near the restaurant Mason had mentioned in his text. Our usual place, which I correctly guessed was the small bistro 3 blocks from Brooke's apartment where I'd previously tracked them meeting. From our vantage point in a cafe across the street, we watched Mason arrive at 12:50, securing a table on the outdoor patio. Brooke joined him 10 minutes later, looking anxious as she slid into the seat across from him. Though we couldn't hear their conversation, their body language told a story of tension and disagreement. Mason leaning forward intently, gesturing. With obvious agitation, Brooke alternately defensive and placating. At one point, Mason reached across the table to grasp Brooke's hand, his expression shifting from frustration to something softer, more intimate. She responded by covering his hand with her free one, a gesture of reassurance that confirmed their relationship went far beyond brother-in-law and sister-in-law. Their lunch lasted nearly 2 hours, evolving from tense discussion to what appeared to be strategic planning, with Mason eventually taking notes on his phone as Brooke spoke at length, occasionally touching her stomach in the unconscious gesture of expectant mothers. "I've seen enough," I said to Vanessa as they finally paid their bill. "Let's go before they spot us." Back at my house, I finally allowed the full implications to sink in. The baby was almost certainly Mason's. Their affair had progressed far beyond what I'd initially discovered, and they were actively coordinating some plan that involved Brooke moving into our home. "What now?" Vanessa asked as we sat in my living room, the afternoon stretching before us. I checked the time, 3:30 p.m. Mason wouldn't be home until much later, given his text about another evening work session on the revitalization project. "Now I call my attorney," I replied, reaching for my phone. "And then my parents." Melissa Garcia answered on the second ring, her tone shifting from professional greeting to focused attention when I identified myself. "The situation has evolved," I explained, outlining the pregnancy revelation, the contradictory stories, and the lunch meeting I'd just witnessed. "I'm ready to proceed with divorce filing, but there's a complication. I need to understand if the child is legally relevant to our proceedings. If your husband has fathered a child with another woman, it doesn't directly impact property division or the grounds for divorce," Melissa explained. "However, it could potentially influence spousal support considerations if his financial obligations change due to child support requirements." She promised to expedite the divorce filing, advising me to secure my financial assets immediately and collect any remaining evidence before confrontation became inevitable. The call to my parents was infinitely more difficult. How do you tell your mother and father that their younger daughter is pregnant, potentially by their older daughter's husband, that both have been engaging in a deception that would tear the family apart? I chose directness, asking them to come to my house that evening for an important discussion. Their concern was immediate. Parents instinctively recognize when something is seriously wrong, but I refused to elaborate over the phone, knowing this conversation needed to happen in person. By 7 p.m., the key players in what was about to become a family implosion were assembled in my living room. My parents, looking worried and confused. Vanessa, providing silent support from a chair in the corner, and me, standing by the fireplace, documentation organized in a folder on the mantel beside me. Only Mason and Brooke were missing, both having texted their regrets about working late, unaware that their absence was precisely what I had planned. For this initial conversation, "Claire, you're scaring us," my mother said, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "What's going on? Are you ill?" "I'm not ill," I assured her, struggling to find the right words to begin this impossible conversation. "But I've discovered something that affects our entire family, and I needed you to hear it from me directly, with evidence to support what might otherwise seem unbelievable." Over the next 45 minutes, I methodically presented what I had learned: Mason's affair with Brooke, the evidence from his laptop, their coordinated deception about the pregnancy, their secret planning. I showed my parents the journal entries, the photos, the text messages, building an irrefutable case that left no room for denial or alternative explanation. My father sat in stunned silence, the color progressively draining from his face as the evidence mounted. My mother alternated between gasping in disbelief and shaking her head in mute denial, tears streaming down her face by the time I finished. "I don't understand," she finally whispered. How could they do this? To you? To us? I've been asking myself the same question, I acknowledged, my own composure finally beginning to crack. The why doesn't matter as much as what happens next. What are you going to do? My father asked, finding his voice at last. It was the first time I'd seen him look his age, the betrayal aging him visibly as we sat there. I've already initiated divorce proceedings, I explained. My attorney filed the paperwork this afternoon. Mason will be served tomorrow. My mother gasped. So quickly? Without trying to work through this? I shook my head, understanding her impulse toward reconciliation, but knowing it was impossible. There's no coming back from this level of betrayal. Mom. Mason and Brooke didn't just have an affair. They created an elaborate deception that would have continued indefinitely if I hadn't discovered the truth. They were planning some future together while systematically lying to all of us. And the baby? My father asked, his voice hoarse. Is it really Mason's? I believe so, based on everything I've uncovered. The Kyle story was fabricated to explain the pregnancy without revealing the affair. My parents absorbed this final blow in silence, the full weight of what it meant for our family settling over the room like a heavy shroud. Their first grandchild would be born of betrayal, a permanent reminder of the breach in our family's trust. What can we do? My mother finally asked, wiping tears with a crumpled tissue. Be here for me, I said simply, and prepare yourselves for what comes next. When Mason is served tomorrow, everything will change. He'll know that I know. Brooke will realize her deception has failed. They'll either deny everything despite the evidence, or they'll attempt to justify their actions. And you want us to confront them with you? My father clarified, a protective anger beginning to replace his initial shock. No, I said firmly. This part I need to handle myself, but I wanted you to know the truth before whatever story they attempt to spin. And I wanted you to understand why I'll be leaving Portland for a while after this is done. The remainder of the evening was spent in painful but necessary discussion, practical considerations about living arrangements and financial separation, emotional processing of the betrayal that had fractured our family, and planning for the confrontation that now loomed inevitably on the horizon. When my parents finally left, shaken but supportive, Vanessa hugged me tightly. You did the hardest part, she said. Telling your parents took incredible courage. I shook my head slightly. The hardest part is still ahead. Tomorrow I face Mason. That night, as I lay in the guest bedroom, having moved my essential belongings there while Mason worked late, I felt a curious sense of calm descend. The chaotic emotions of the past week had coalesced into a clear-eyed determination that left no room for second-guessing or self-doubt. Mason and Brooke had made their choices, calculated in their betrayal, deliberate in their deception. Tomorrow, they would face the consequences of those choices, and I would begin the process of reclaiming my life from the wreckage they had created. Morning arrived with the ping of a text message, Mason informing me he'd stayed at the office overnight to finish a critical segment of the proposal and would be coming home around noon to shower and change before an afternoon client meeting. Perfect timing. I confirmed with Melissa that the process server was scheduled for 12:30 p.m., giving Mason just enough time to arrive home before being served the divorce papers. Then I texted Brooke, asking if she could come to the house at 12:15, ostensibly to discuss her housing request with both Mason and me present. She agreed readily, unaware that her carefully constructed deception was about to collapse. By noon, everything was in place. Vanessa had reluctantly departed for Seattle that morning, needed back at work, but extracting my promise to call immediately after the confrontation. My belongings were packed in suitcases waiting in my car trunk, enough for an extended stay, at the hotel I'd booked under a name Mason wouldn't think to check. My parents were on standby, prepared to offer support once the initial confrontation concluded. Brooke arrived exactly at 12:15, looking hopeful and slightly nervous as I welcomed her into the house. "Is Mason here yet?" she asked, glancing toward the kitchen. "He should be any minute," I replied, my tone neutral. "Can I get you something to drink while we wait?" She declined, settling on the sofa with one hand resting protectively over her slightly rounded belly. We made strained small talk for about 10 minutes before the sound of Mason's key in the lock signaled his arrival. His expression when he entered the living room and saw Brooke sitting there was one of poorly concealed panic, quickly masked with forced casualness. "Brooke, I didn't know you were coming over." "I invited her," I explained calmly. "I thought we should discuss her housing situation together, all three of us." Mason's eyes darted between us, clearly trying to assess what had been said before his arrival. "Of course," he agreed, setting down his bag. "Let me just wash up quickly." "Before we get into that," I said, remaining standing while they both sat uncomfortably, "there's something I need to address." The doorbell rang, right on schedule. "Excuse me for a moment," I said, moving to answer it while Mason and Brooke exchanged confused glances. The process server was professionally discreet, handing me the documents with minimal fuss before departing. I returned to the living room, divorce papers in hand. "Mason Reynolds?" I asked formally, though we all knew the absurdity of the question. "These are for you." I extended the envelope, watching comprehension dawn in his eyes as he recognized the legal formatting visible through the translucent paper. His hand trembled slightly as he accepted it. "What is this?" Brooke asked, confusion evident in her voice. "Divorce papers," I answered, turning to face my sister directly. "Something that becomes necessary when your husband fathers a child with your sister." The color drained from Brooke's face. "What are you talking about?" "Please," I said wearily. "Enough with the deception. I know everything. The affair, the pregnancy, your coordinated lies about Kyle being the father, even your plan to move in here as some kind of transition strategy." Mason had opened the envelope, scanning the contents with a growing alarm. "Claire, you're making assumptions that—" "Save it," I cut him off. "I've seen your journal entries about falling in love with Brooke. I've read your texts coordinating. Stories after she told me about the pregnancy. I watched you hold hands at lunch yesterday while you planned your next moves. The silence that followed was deafening. The peculiar quiet that comes when denial becomes impossible, when lies can no longer be maintained. We never meant to hurt you," Brooke finally whispered, tears filling her eyes. "And yet here we are?" I replied, a bitter laugh escaping before I could suppress it. 16 weeks pregnant with my husband's child, asking to move into my home, lying to my face about paternity, all while planning a future together behind my back. If this isn't deliberately causing hurt, I'm not sure what is. Mason stood, reaching toward me. "Claire, please. We need to talk about this rationally. It's not what you think." I stepped back, avoiding his touch. "It's exactly what I think. And there's nothing left to talk about. I've filed for divorce. I've informed my parents of the situation. I've packed my things and arranged alternative accommodation." "You told Mom and Dad?" Brooke gasped, genuine horror in her expression. "Of course I did," I replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "Did you think I would protect you from the consequences of your actions? Shield you from their disappointment and hurt, just as I've been doing your entire life?" Mason attempted to regain control of the situation, his tone shifting to the reasonable negotiator I'd heard him use in professional conflicts. "Claire, I understand you're hurt and angry. You have every right to be. But making permanent decisions in this emotional state isn't wise." "My decisions aren't emotional. They're based on evidence and self-preservation," I corrected him. "The papers include a preliminary division of assets based on Oregon law. My attorney will contact yours to finalize details." "You've already gotten an attorney?" he asked, genuinely shocked at my level of preparation. "Unlike you, who've had months to plan your exit." I've had only days to arrange mine. Yes, I've consulted legal counsel, secured my financial assets, and made living arrangements. This marriage is over, effective immediately. The finality in my tone seemed to penetrate whatever defensive barrier Mason had constructed. He sank back onto the sofa, the divorce papers clutched forgotten in his hand. "What about the baby?" Brooke asked in a small voice, her hand again moving protectively to her stomach. "That's between you, Mason, and eventually, my parents," I replied. "The child is innocent in all this, and despite everything, it's still my niece or nephew. But I won't be involved in co-parenting arrangements or playing happy extended family. Some betrayals can't be overcome." I moved toward the door, picking up my purse from the entryway table. "I'll have movers collect the rest of my things next week. My attorney will coordinate the timing." "Where are you going?" Mason asked, finally finding his voice again. "Away from here. Away from both of you." I paused, hand on the doorknob, allowing myself one final moment of direct honesty. You know what the saddest part is? If you had been honest from the beginning, if you had come to me when these feelings first developed and ended our marriage honorably before beginning a relationship with Brooke, I would have eventually accepted it. Been hurt, yes. Angry, certainly. But I would have respected honesty. I looked between them, these two people I had trusted most in the world. Instead, you chose deception and betrayal. You lied to my face while planning your future together. You were willing to let me discover your relationship only after carefully arranging everything to your advantage. That calculated cruelty is what I can't forgive. With those final words, I walked out the door of the home I had shared with Mason, leaving behind not just a marriage and a sister, but the person I had been. The trusting, accommodating woman who had been blind to the deception surrounding her. As I drove away, glancing one last time in the rearview mirror at the house that had once represented my future, I felt something unexpected beneath the hurt and anger. A sense of liberation. Mason and Brooke's betrayal had shattered the life I had built, but in doing so, had freed me from relationships built on deception and manipulation. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with legal proceedings, family reconfiguration, and emotional healing. But for the first time since discovering Mason's laptop, I felt certain that whatever came next would be on my terms. Honest, clear-eyed, and ultimately leading to a life more authentic than the one built on lies that I had just left behind. In choosing each other through betrayal, Mason and Brooke had inadvertently given me the most painful gift possible, the opportunity to rediscover myself without the constraints of a marriage that had failed long before I realized it was broken, and that, despite everything, was a foundation I could build upon. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.